It's recording you.
This is lesson 30.
Almost
and we
done.
get to start part 3 of Wonderstruck. What happens next? It says Ben hadn't been outside in days. The city was still burning hot and he was sweating by the time he reached Kincaid's. The store was larger than he expected. Books spilled off the shelves, covered tables, and teetered in piles. Sunshine poured in through the front windows, lighting up the dust as it spiraled through the air. The air inside was cool and smelled like old paper. There was also the faint aroma of bread from the bakery next door. In the center of the store, a staircase rose to an overstuffed balcony. Every step was lined with more books. There were no customers and no one behind the counter. The only sign of life was a sleeping black cat near the cash register. A battered clock hanging at an angle behind the counter said 4:15. Ben wiped his forehead with the inside of his shirt and then walked to the counter. Hello? Hello? He hoped he was speaking loudly. When no one emerged, he knocked on the counter. Still, no one answered. Only the cat responded, jumping to the floor and bolting up the stairs. Ben decided to follow the cat. Maybe the owner was upstairs. He climbed the steps. There didn't seem to be anyone around. He was thirsty and couldn't remember the last time he had eaten. A wave of nausea passed through him, and for a moment, he thought he might be sick right there on the stairs. He sat on a step and put his head between his knees. He thought about Jamie, and he took out his notebook. He flipped through the pages, looking at the things Jamie had written. I just wanted you to stay and be my friend. An icy blast from the air conditioner made Ben shiver. Slowly, he lifted his head, unsure of how long he should sit on the steps, waiting for someone to appear. Back to Rose.
Ooh.
Now, we know that this is Rose's story because it is illustrated text, but I want you to take note of this person that is highlighted. This is an older woman highlighted on the in the picture down here in the corner. Who do you think this older woman might be? Okay, and again, so we're kind of zoomed in, and this is the same older lady, and she's highlighted. Do we see any clues on this page of what this could be? The only thing I see is kind of the way people are dressed in this picture. This doesn't look like the 20s anymore.
Heat wave.
You see where's that? Oh, on this newspaper, it says heat. So it's summer and it's hot. And look at this guy wiping his sweat. This is a picture of the back of the old woman. She's walking down the road. And here she is again, and look where she's walking to. Kincaid's book. It says established in 1937. So that is when they opened. So we know that this is past 1937 because this bookstore would not be open yet if it was still 1927, right? So Kincaid's books. What do we see here? Do we notice what this is? Notice that it's a striped shirt. Okay, and so the old lady walks into Kincaid Books. And we see a picture of her face. Ben recognized the old woman as soon as she stepped through the door. She was the one who had stopped in front of the wolf diorama that first day with Jamie. She wiped her face with a handkerchief as she walked up to an old man with round black glasses who had appeared behind the counter. She kissed him on the cheek. They didn't speak to each other, but their hands began to move, making all sorts of shapes and patterns. Corey Jarvis is freaking out right now.
Why?
It took only a moment for Ben to figure out that they were using sign language. Because he's got so much to say. Like he has so many inferences.
Oh, I know. I have kids that are flipping out because
After a few exchanges, the old man turned his head toward the phone, held up one hand to the old woman, and then picked up the receiver. The old woman continued to sign to the old man while he spoke on the phone. Ben marveled at how the man could have two conversations at once. He figured that only the woman was deaf since the man was using the phone. The couple kept signing after the old man hung up. At several points, he and the old woman laughed. Ben was amazed by the speed of their hands and the pleasure in their faces. He didn't think he'd ever be able to sign that quickly. No matter how much he studied, he thought about the alphabet Jamie had taught him, but his mind went blank when he tried to remember the letters. Holding the notebook and the pen in one hand, Ben started to stand, but his left leg had fallen asleep beneath him, and before he could brace himself, it buckled and he toppled down the stairs. He landed on the floor with a hard thud amid an avalanche of books. Ben looked up into the terrified eyes of the old man and the old woman. He groaned as they helped him sit up. The old man was speaking to him. Ben shook his head and pointed to his ears. I can't hear. When they began to sign, Ben shook his head again. I don't know sign language. Slowly, he looked around until he spotted the notebook and pen which had fallen nearby. The old man retrieved them and wrote, Anything broken? Ben stretched his arms and legs and said, I don't think so, but he was rattled from the fall. May I have some water? The old man nodded and disappeared into the back. Ben noticed that the old woman had become very still. She was studying him with the oddest expression. It looked like confusion and wonder and sadness all at the same time. The old man returned with the water. As Ben drank it, he watched the old woman sign to the old man and then look back at Ben. He reached forward and touched the locket around Ben's neck. He glanced down and saw that it had opened. And so there's a picture, we're back to Rose's story, right? And it is a picture of somebody holding a locket with a man in it. Back to Ben's story. The old woman covered her mouth with her hand and then grabbed onto the old man. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She wiped her eyes with her handkerchief and then she placed her hand on the side of Ben's face. Her thumb brushed momentarily across his skin. 1,000 questions ran through his mind, but before he could ask any of them, the old woman reached for the pen and the notebook. Ben watched her trembling hand as it held the pen over the paper before she began to write. Then she turned the pad so that he could read what she had written. Ben? Oh, it's Ben! He's in Rose's story! What's he doing here?
There's Ben. That's what he looks like. Now you don't have to visualize him anymore.
And there's a picture of the old lady, and she is holding his face.
Oh, how I wish we were doing this whole class.
Oh, I know. Everybody is freaking out right
They
now.
are.
The old woman's hands were warm. She pulled Ben to her and held him tightly. What was going on? Ben pulled back and said, How do you know my name? The old woman seemed to be able to read his lips, but the old man translated Ben's words into signs. The woman took the pen, pointed to herself, and wrote, Rose. She pointed the pen toward the old man. My brother, Walter. Ah! Ben asked again, How do you know my name? Do you know my father? Walter signed Ben's questions to Rose and wrote the notebook. Where's your mother? Ben didn't know how to answer. It would take so long to explain. Then he remembered the pages he'd written for Jamie. He flipped back in the notebook and handed it to Rose. He rubbed the locket between his fingers and waited while she and Walter read the story. When they were done, Rose hugged Ben again. He resisted at first, but finally he let himself be held, and it was comforting, even from a stranger. Rose pulled back and wiped her eyes. I'm so sorry about your mom, she wrote. Do your aunt and uncle know where you are? Ben shook his head. They must be so worried. Write down their phone number. She gestured toward her brother and held her hand to her ear like a phone, indicating Walter should make a call. Ben wrote down the number, relieved that his aunt and uncle would finally know where he was and that he was safe. How did you find us? Rose wrote. Ben's pockets were full of stuff, but he rooted around until he found the original bookmark and the new one from the dictionary Jamie had brought him. He unfolded them and handed them both to Rose. She and Walter read Danny's note to Elaine on the back of the first one. Then Ben reached into his back pocket and pulled out one more thing. The Wonderstruck book. For Danny, love M. And these are old fingers with a ring around it. This is Rose's hands. She's the one holding the book.
Do we know who M is yet?
We don't know who M is. As the old woman touched the book, Ben said again, Please tell me how you know my name. Reading his lips, Rose wrote, We met a long time ago. Except for the time in the museum a few days earlier, Ben was sure he'd never seen this woman before. How did we meet? Ben asked as Walter translated. When? It's a long story, but it starts here. Rose pointed to the red M, opposite of the title page of Wonderstruck. Walter worked at the museum before he opened this store. He gave this book to me when I was young. I drew the roses in the leaves like a signature. I don't understand. It's signed M and your name is Rose. Rose turned to Walter, who translated the words she missed. M is for mother. She wrote.
Some inferences are coming true.
Yes. You are Danny's mother? As Ben said the words, it dawned on him what this meant. Rose's face somehow changed before his eyes. Her skin, her white hair, her slender fingers no longer belonged to a stranger. He wrote, You're my grandmother? Rose wiped the tears from her eyes and smiled. Ben hugged her again. He felt the soft fabric of her blouse, her ribs moving as she breathed. After a few moments, he pulled away and asked, "Where is he? I've come all the way from Minnesota to find him." Walter translated, but the old woman seemed lost in thought. "What do you know about him?" she finally wrote. Ben spoke in a rush, but Walter kept up with him. "I don't know anything about him. My mom never talked about him. After she died, I found Wonderstruck and the note on the bookmark. That's how I learned his name was Daniel and that he lived in New York." Ben explained about going to his apartment, ending up at the museum, and finding the wolf diorama in the files. "I read a letter he wrote to my mom, so I know that he used to work in the museum and that he made the diorama and that they must have met when he came to Minnesota to do research. But that's all I know." When Walter finished signing for Rose, she signed back, and then she nodded and wrote, "I will answer all of your questions, Ben, as best I can, but first, tell me if you've eaten." Ben shook his head. He had almost forgotten how hungry he was. Walter went to the back and returned with a sandwich and a cup of orange juice, as well as a plate full of pretzels, which Ben ate quickly. After Walter had taken the dishes back to the office, he and Rose signed something, and then she wrote, "I want to answer your questions, but I can't do it here. We have to take a subway ride. It's a long trip. Are you up for it?" "Yes," Ben said, "but why can't you tell me here?" Rose read his lips and squeezed his shoulders. Her face looked sad and complicated. Ben understood that the only thing he could do was follow her and wait for her to tell him what he wanted to know. "Are you ready?" And Ben rubbed the smooth silver locket around his neck and nodded. He was ready. And here we see a picture of Rose and Ben walking out of Kincaid's bookstore. Now, what I'm shocked to know is that my classes never took out Rose. It said Rose Kincaid on the postcard and Kincaid's bookstore. My class never pieced that together.
Mine did, but I had to kind of coach them along a little
Yeah,
bit. But
I
they
did not.
finally, yeah.
I didn't give them any clues. I wanted to see, because usually
Yeah.
I have one kid that goes, "Kincaid!"
Yeah.
I never had the, I'm sure they would have gotten it as we
The
read
aha
through.
moments like Helen Keller has.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we see a picture of Ben and Rose, and they're walking down the subway. Let's take a look at this picture and see what we're noticing here.
Curly headed and striped shirt.
Striped shirt. And here we see Rose and Ben. They're waiting for the subway to come through. Curly headed and striped shirt.
Look at the wall though back there. Look what posters up there. Star Wars.
Star Wars. Cody would like that.
Mm-hmm.
So now they're on the subway, Rose and Ben, and they're looking at each other, and she's smiling, and he seems to be content. Here we are staring at each other, and they're headed to Queens, which is still New York. It's just across the bridge. You can't get there. You drive there, but you'd have to go across the bridge because Manhattan's a island. So they're off the subway, and they're coming down the stairs.
Jamie.
Curly hair, striped shirt. And they come to this big building with a huge globe, and there they are walking, and in the tiny corner you can see curly hair and striped shirt. This is the Queens Museum of Art. And we see Ben and Rose walking to the doors, and we see curly hair and striped shirt. And as they get to the museum, we see Rose digging in her purse and pulling out a key. It says they entered the lobby of the museum, and Rose turned on the lights, motioning for Ben to sit down on a bench. It was hot and stuffy inside. Rose sat beside Ben and retrieved Ben's notebook and pen from her bag. "It's going to take me a long time to write this story for you. I need you to be patient with me, okay? I've never written all this down for anyone." "A story?" Ben didn't want a story. He wanted to meet his dad. Still, he nodded and continued reading as fast as she wrote, line after line in the notebook. "I've worked here for 15 years. But the story I need to tell you begins a long time before that. When I was little, I could see New York from my window, but my parents never let me go there. Too dangerous for a deaf girl to leave the house, they said. So as a child, I used to write little notes and send them out into the world because I felt so alone. I ran away from home many times, and it was Walter who finally rescued me. I found him at the American Museum of Natural History." Ben tapped Rose's shoulder and pointed to, well, it says AMNH, and so he didn't know what that meant. She told him, the American Museum of Natural History. Of course, Ben nodded for her to go on. "I knew Walter had gotten his first job selling books at the museum as part of a new exhibition. Ben tapped Rose. He mimed opening a book and mouthed the word Wonderstruck. Rose nodded. I was 12 when I ran away to New York. Walter found me while I was hiding in the exhibition room. Later, he took me to his apartment and gave me the book. I've loved museums and cabinets of wonders ever since. I begged him to help me to get out of the house away from our father. I wanted to stay in New York City. I wanted to learn things. At Walter's apartment, I remember gazing out at the gigantic buildings at night. They were so beautiful. I had spent so much time looking at the city from across the water in Hoboken that I was ecstatic to finally be in the middle of it. Walter helped me find a school for the deaf children. I didn't even know there was such a thing that it existed. Our parents were married when my mother was very young. She gave birth to Walter when she was only 17. I came along 8 years later, and soon after that my parents divorced. So when Rose ran away, she was 12, which means Walter was 20.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very big scandal back then because my mother was famous. One day I'll show you my scrapbook. Our parents resisted letting me go, but my brother fought with them and convinced them that I needed to be at a good boarding school where everyone was deaf. Until I went to school, I had never met another deaf person. I didn't know it, but this was what I had been waiting for. There were so many people like me. Unfortunately, I didn't like our classes because we were forced to lip read and speak, which I hated to do and was never good at before I went to school. I had a lip reading and speech tutor at home, but I hated him. Once I cut up his book and turned it into paper building so I wouldn't have to practice. But the other students taught me how to sign when we were not in class, and the world opened up. I discovered I could really communicate and make jokes. I never knew how much fun it was to make jokes and laugh with other people. I was never happier. At the same school, I met a boy who would become your grandfather, Bill Lobel. He was the handsomest boy in my class, strong, good at sports. Like so many of our classmates, he worked with big machines on printing press. Deaf people aren't bothered by the noise, of course, so in those days, many of the deaf boys learned how to be printers. I, too, needed a job after I graduated. Walter helped me get work at the AMNH in the exhibitions department. I'd always loved making things with my hands, and I was so happy to work there, helping to create miniatures of Indian pueblos, Mexican villages, and Arabian cities. Bill and I got married after we finished school. Many people, especially our parents, thought it was a bad idea for two deaf people to get married. Everyone worried we would pass our deafness on to our children, but Bill became deaf from an illness when he was 9 years old, and no one was sure how or exactly when I became deaf. It might have been how I was born, although my father, a doctor, always said it happened when I was 2 and had a bad fall. Bill's parents, like mine, had a hard time coping with a deaf child. He had 5 older siblings, all of whom could hear, so no one paid him much attention. But at school, he blossomed just as much as I did. When I became pregnant, I wondered what it would be like to have a deaf baby. I knew we could give him the upbringing we had missed before we got our school. But it wasn't easy being deaf, and we were happy Danny could hear. That just made everyone even more worried, though. How could 2 deaf people raise a hearing baby? Our parents pointed out that we couldn't hear a deaf baby or hear a crying baby at night. Even worse to them, they worried the baby would never learn to speak. Well, it was hard, but with the help of friends, the voices on the radio, which we left on all the time, and yes, even our parents, we did it. And we loved Danny more than anything. Rose paused and massaged her hand as Ben caught up. Everything seemed to vanish for him except the pen and the paper and the story. Even though he could hear, I don't think it was easy for Danny. In many ways, he ended up in the same position Bill and I were in growing up. We were so different from our parents, but Danny became a child of 2 worlds, the hearing and the deaf. He could sign so beautifully, better than many deaf people. Once he was old enough, he sometimes had to act as interpreter for us out in the world, translating between sign language and spoken language. But he never complained. He was a happy child, and the happiest when he was drawing. He loved to paint pictures of animals, and he built the most wonderful little sculptures. He often came to the museum with me when he was growing up. He'd sit next to me in the model making department, working on his own little projects while I worked on mine. The staff members gave Danny a run of the place and taught him about every aspect of the museum. Soon he had fallen in love with geography and science and math as well as art. They let him play in the half-finished dioramas in the storage room. Ben's hand went into his pocket and he carefully pulled out the seashell turtle. Rose's eyes grew wide and he handed it to her, and he could tell from her expression that she knew exactly what it was. She turned it over in her palm before returning it to Ben. He took the notebook and pen. My mom gave me the turtle when I was going into 3rd grade. She used to call me Turtle because I was shy. She never told me it was from my dad. Rose smiled and took back the pen and notebook. After the Wonderstruck exhibition closed, they were going to tear it down, but they never got around to it. As the years went by, the room collected dust and slowly it became a storage room. Your dad used to hide inside the cabinet, which is where he found the seashell turtle. He loved that turtle and used to carry it around in his pocket. Ben smiled, imagining his father giving the turtle one cold winter's night to his mom. Returning it to his own pocket, she gestured for Rose to continue the story. She drew an arrow going back to the words, the half-finished dioramas in the storage room, and then went on. The staff showed Danny what went into creating every aspect of the dioramas. The museum was the one place he wanted to work when he grew up, and once he was old enough, they were eager to hire him. We were so proud. I worked there for many years, several of them alongside Danny, but in 1962, planning was underway for the 1964 World's Fair, which was to be held in Queens. Countries from all over the world would be participating. There were going to be shows, rides, and all sorts of attractions. One of those attractions was going to be a scale model of the entire city of New York, all 5 boroughs, all 895,000 buildings. It would be almost 10,000 square feet, the largest architectural model ever built. They named it the Panorama, and they needed people to create and glue down all the buildings and carve the parks and the hills. When I found out about the job opening, I jumped at the chance to take it. I was sad to leave the AMNH after so many wonderful years, but I couldn't say no. As a child, dreaming about New York, I built the city out of paper in my room, and so in a way, I'd been preparing for this job my entire life. I worked on the model of New York for 2 years. I made hundreds of tiny buildings, apartment towers, museums, stores. It was heaven. Rose stopped and rubbed her hand again. Then she took Ben's hand and led him into the dark, cavernous space. She pressed a few buttons in a control panel hidden in the wall, and suddenly a giant spotlight lit up the room. Wow. So here they are in this room with all of these buildings, and this would be the panorama that Rose helped create. Look at how vast it is. It just covers this whole room. And I mean, you can tell this is a big room because they are small. And this must have taken so long. Does this come with?
No. It's not on there, but part 3 summary.
Okay, you need to work on the part 3 summary that is on the Google Classroom.
And
we got one more to do.